Hello there guys. So some of you may already recognise me, but for those of you who don't, my name is Abby Lloyd. I am a third year sociology student and today I'm going to be guest lecturing for you. So I've never done this before, so please do bear with me. And I will give you guys a chance at the end to ask any questions. Obviously I'm not doing this live today, but I will be providing my email address, so if you guys need anything cleared up, just let me know. So today I'm going to be bringing you a session on fat embodiment in the 21st century. So I know that fat studies is something that Joe covered just a few lectures ago. So today I'm just going to be breaking that down a little bit more, getting a little bit more in depth, and just giving you guys plenty of real world examples that will hopefully come in really handy when you're doing your assignments. You know, you can never have too many references, you can never have too many examples. So yeah, I'm just going to try and create a really cohesive argument for you guys today. We're going to be delving into some of the differing perspectives on fat embodiment, which I personally found really interesting because I'm doing it for my dissertation. And again, I'm going to be linking it back to lots of Joe's other lectures as well, and kind of bridging the gap there. So again, you know, I think linking it back to the other lectures, one, it's really relevant. It's a great way to create really cohesive arguments in your work. And secondly, it's, you know, stuff we've already covered. So hopefully it will just make what I'm talking about a little bit easier to digest, a little bit easier to understand. So yeah, brilliant. Let's get started. Okay, so as I already mentioned to you guys, today we're going to be covering fat embodiment in the 21st century. So I'm just going to briefly talk you through what I'm going to be covering today. Today I'm going to be formulating an argument surrounding the different kind of theoretical perspectives on fat embodiment, both positive and negative, and how they tend to interact with each other and coincide with each other and critique each other, more importantly. So as you'll see on the screen, we're going to begin by talking about the anti-obesity approach, which is definitely the one that I found the most interesting. And in this, we're going to cover things like self-regulation and assigning blame. We're going to be talking about macro governance of the fat body and state policies. And their kind of role in that. So again, we could be talking about things like the sugar tax, the Change for Life campaign, which I'm sure you guys are really familiar with. I'm also going to be discussing media portrayals of the fat body. And then we're going to be moving on to the other end of the spectrum, where we're going to be looking into the body positivity perspective, which is an entirely different ballgame. So in that, we're going to be looking well, we're definitely going to be adapting a more social constructionist kind of view surrounding fat embodiment. So we're going to be talking about globalization, and we're going to, you know, delve into social class differences. So kind of investigate, you know, is fat embodiment different for some people than others, and if so, why? I'm also going to look into sexual desirability and the fetishization of fat. I hate saying that word. So all in all, we're going to be gaining a really well-rounded argument regarding fat embodiment. As we are looking at fat embodiment in the 21st century, I'm definitely going to be referring back to the media throughout this in an attempt to give you guys some really good real-world examples, and I'm sure loads of them are things that you guys would have already heard about or watched or seen. For any of you that quite like to dabble in watching YouTube videos or Netflix, I've got quite a lot of really good references for you. And yeah, so I really found that the beauty of this topic is that it can be linked to so many different sources and areas of sociology. So if you're anything like me, you'll find absolutely no issues finding your own examples to fill any gaps that you might have. Okay, so let's get started on our first approach. So first, well, let's just take a step back for a second. So as we've already talked about, there are two polarised theoretical approaches that we must take into consideration when we're looking at fat literature. So the anti-obesity paradigm is the first one I'm going to talk about, and then later on we're going to get onto the body positivity perspective. So that's a little bit later on. So amongst this anti-obesity paradigm, it is worth noting that many practitioners adopt a fairly unproblematized approach towards fat embodiment. And the reference that you can use for that is Harjunen 2009, page 13. So that's HARJUNEN 2009. And that's that practitioners adopt a fairly unproblematized approach towards fat embodiment. And if we just delve into what this means for a second, this kind of unproblematized approach is often demonstrated through the way that people talk and use language. So you'll find that, you know, a lot of practitioners within this perspective, they use terminology like overweight. That's a really popular one. When discussing their problems with the fat body. So they don't really seek to automatically target the really derogatory commentary. You know, they're kind of very factually accurate in saying overweight. So a prime example of this can actually be seen in the work of Mirza 2013. So that's M-I-R-Z-A, Mirza 2013. And Mirza referred to this kind of notion of the overweight body as being the leading contributor to the global burden of chronic diseases. So again, chronic diseases automatically, you know, we think of, you know, inherited diseases like cancers, or we think of high blood pressure or diabetes. So all these different diseases, all these different health concerns that are all really closely interlinked with this anti-obesity perspective. You know, it really, really joins it in very closely with this idea of fatness. So because of this, it can be argued that the anti-obesity paradigm can definitely kind of most prominently be characterised by its positivist approach to exploring the body. And this is because it consistently seeks to document the emergence of these social issues deriving from fat embodiment, whilst objectively presenting the fat body as a detrimental health condition that poses a threat to wider society. So that's kind of a lot of information I've just chucked at you just there. So if we just take a little step back for a second. So what I mean by this positivist approach, so, you know, as we would have covered in previous years, positivism is all about this idea of solid data and scientific fact being the most reliable sources of information. So this is why this approach really seeks to document these social issues, like the work of Mirza. He obviously points to diseases, but again, there can be other problems that this approach identifies, like problems with the aesthetics of the fat body. Any problems, it likes to point them out, and they use the media to do that often. You know, and again, this idea of presenting the fat body as this really like detrimental health condition that poses this threat to wider society, they're really kind of saying to people, hey, if you're fat, you can get diabetes, you can get high blood pressure, you could develop a cancer. So, you know, they're really using scare tactics, and they're really kind of trying to say to people that everyone is at risk of becoming obese. Everyone. So that idea of risk, I'm sure a lot of your minds already would have bounced back to Beck, Risk Society. That's a really, really important reference that you can use for this, just to back this up, give it a little bit more theoretical backing. So if we move on a little bit, I'm just going to give you a few examples. So I've included a couple on the slide, but again, this kind of language and examples like these are so disappointingly, to be honest, disappointingly easy to find, and I'll tell you why in a second. So this consistent presentation of the fat body as being this widespread social risk, this social problem, has gradually led this perspective to coin the term obesity epidemic. And you know, this term obesity epidemic, we see it so frequently documented in today's media, or at least I do anyway. but I'm sure you guys will have seen it a million and one times yourselves. But again, on the board, I have provided an example. So a prime past example of this comes from McVeigh, 2009. It's just on the board there. And McVeigh wrote an article for The Guardian titled "Who's to Blame for Britain's Worsening Obesity Epidemic?" So you'll note, 2009, this could be seen as a little bit outdated. Usually they say go for references within the last 10 years, but I've included it anyway because I want to kind of point out that despite this particular article being published, 10 or so years ago now, it's really clear that this kind of language is still being recycled amongst today's media, and that's a really, really important point. This isn't, this anti-obesity approach, it hasn't just come around out of nowhere in the last few years. This is a really long-standing, ongoing approach, if you will, or issue within society. So again, I've included a slightly more up-to-date reference here, and this one comes from the BBC, and it was published late last year, maybe like December time, and it was titled "Obesity Epidemic Increases Risks from COVID-19." And overall, this use of terminology across so many different various media platforms, this obesity epidemic, especially during a time of such global panic and anxiety around the recent coronavirus pandemic, it's a clear demonstration of how scare tactics are an integral aspect of this anti-obesity perspective. Even in a time where everyone's panicking, they're staying in their houses, they're social distancing, they're worrying for their relatives, this anti-obesity approach is relentless in trying to, tie everything back to obesity. If you're obese, increase your risk of COVID-19. Don't be obese because it will lead you to get all these chronic health issues. Scare tactics. That is a really, really important point to take away. So, this kind of language. Okay, so let's move on to the next section. So next I want to talk to you about self-regulation and assigning blame. So within the anti-obesity paradigm, there is a really significant emphasis placed on trying to, eradicate and get rid of this idea of the obesity epidemic. And as previously established, fear-mongering regimes are implemented within this discourse in an attempt to advertise how every citizen is at risk of obesity. So again, risk society, Beck, really, really good reference. So by advertising how every citizen is at risk of becoming obese and therefore developing the problems that come with it, this challenges the population and individuals to ensure that their own lifestyle behaviours are distanced from those associated with the fat body. And a really, really good reference to this is Evans et al., 2011. So, what they're really saying here is that these scare tactics, they're put in place to make people sit back and think, oh, well, am I having maybe one too many takeaways? Could I cut that down? Don't want to become obese? Or, oh, should I maybe get a gym membership? Or, should I be doing more exercise? I think that these are all things that a lot of people have asked themselves in lockdown as well. There's this idea of, we're all in lockdown, let's have a glow up. Let's come back transformed and different. So it's that idea of, critiquing yourself and being reflexive and thinking, well, I don't want to get all of the health risks associated with obesity. So, what am I doing that could lead me down that path? What can I change? So that's really important. So whilst it's fair to assume that the kind of surveillance and control of personal lifestyle behaviours can be performed on like a macro level through government policy. So again, at the start, I mentioned sugar tax. I mentioned kind of government-sponsored campaigns like the Change for Life campaign. I'm going to come on to that a little bit later. So, you know, while they play a really important role in kind of governing our personal lifestyle behaviours, it's also really important to step back and acknowledge the role of the individual in regulating their own bodily state. And I think that that is what, again, we're linking it back to the media, that's what it's trying to do. These fear-mongering regimes and these examples in the media are trying to sit back and make us evaluate ourselves. Reflexivity, really, really important. So again, just quickly skipping back a little bit, this idea of surveillance and control and monitoring of lifestyle choices. Foucault, 1979, surveillance. Really, really good reference that you could definitely just chuck in there, just sprinkle it in, and that'll really, really help develop your point. So Crossley, 2004, so that's Crossley, 2004, points out that in recent years, people have gradually kind of evolved to become increasingly reflexive beings. So we're constantly reassessing and monitoring and looking at our existence against an ever-growing list of cultural criteria, you know, and obviously one of these is, you know, lifestyle choices, body fat, you know. And this increased reflexivity surrounding physical appearances has really led to a breakdown of the boundary that once divided nature and culture. And a really, really important reference here, and I think it's really, really interesting, is Jager, or Jager, 2000. So Jagger, 2000. And I'd say about page 45 to 65, that is a little journal article, really, really interesting. And Jager basically says that, you know, amongst this idea of dividing nature and culture, we're allowing the body to become a plastic and lifestyle accessory. That's a plastic lifestyle accessory that can be moulded and performed as, you know, as a commodity rather than a biological fact. We're no longer existing as just a biological entity, just that this is me, this is my body, this is how it is. We're displaying ourselves as a commodity. And I'll come on to this idea of commodification a little bit later. So another really key theorist that you can drop in here is Giddens, and I'm sure a lot of you already know what I'm going to say here. So Giddens, 1991, the Body Project. You know, Giddens supports this in saying that this newfound kind of malleability of our physical forms, the way we can change our appearances. You don't like something, you change it. You think you're being unhealthy, you do something different. You go to the gym, you eat different food. So this malleability and changeability of our physical forms has led to the evolution of the body into a body project. And this body project, you know, it's something we work on over time. It's something that's influenced by the media, you know. And this body project, you know, it's basically saying that our bodies can be sculpted and shaped however we want, you know. And Featherstone, I'm sure a lot of you would have used this reference before, Featherstone, 1982, notes that the body can be sculpted and shaped in accordance with the agent's true desires. And this is kind of where I want to step back a little bit and kind of focus in on this idea of true desires. And something that I found really, really interesting when I was researching is, you know, how do you determine what an agent's true desires really are? Because, you know, I might be completely fine, perfect in my appearance. I might think, do you know what? Yeah, I'm feeling myself today. You know, I've got my hair done all nice, I've got my makeup on, and then, you know, have a little stroll into the town centre to pick up a few bits, and I see advertisements here, there and everywhere, and they're telling me, buy this lip gloss, it'll make your lips look bigger. Go and get these injections, it'll make your lips look bigger. And they're constantly kind of spouting this idea of like hegemonic Western beauty at us, and this normative kind of idea of slenderness and how it's in some way better. And that then makes me sit back, or at least it's designed to make me sit back and think, oh, okay, well, you know, maybe I want to look like that now. So my true desire then becomes to look like that, or to adapt lifestyle behaviours that will make me look like that. You know, it's not always that straightforward, but I guess it's definitely a very important point for consideration. You know, how can they necessarily be called true desires when I never originally thought them in the first place? You know, it's taken me seeing something on a billboard or in a magazine or on a TV show to make me think, oh yeah, I want to look like that. You know, but I guess then again we're linking back to capitalism, we're linking back to this idea of creating insecurities and capitalizing on this creation of insecurities. You know, these things didn't exist before I was told that they existed. In my mind, I thought, yeah, I like my face, I like my eyebrows, blah, blah, blah. And then someone's come along and said, oh, well, you know, this is the new trend. This is how we should be looking. And it makes you see things in a completely different light. So just a point for consideration there. Okay, so let's move on, because there's another really interesting point that I want to draw your attention to. So I'm going to start talking about self-care regimes. So within the anti-obesity perspective, obviously we've established that individuals are encouraged to take personal responsibility for their physical appearances, and often a way that this is done is through engaging in self-care regimes, and the reference for this is Schilling, 1993. So that's Schilling, Schilling, 1993. And you know, these self-care regimes, you know, they could see perhaps by Goffman as being a way of managing the performance of the self around others. So you'll see on the slide that I've created this little kind of infographic, you know, showing you, you know, this is kind of what we think. When we think self-care, we think, oh, do a lovely face mask, make myself a smoothie, something healthy, work out, meditate, journal, relax. This is what well, at least this is what I tend to think when I think of self-care. You know, it's kind of spouted all over Instagram, especially in lockdown. You know, that, you know, we should be taking care of ourselves, and this is often what comes to mind. And I found this really, really interesting because self-care, this is what we think it is. It's very glamorized in the media as being, oh, put on a lovely face pack, and oh, look at this smoothie recipe, or this health juice, or this juice cleanse that you should be going on, or whatever it might be. And, you know, it's a very glamorized image of what self-care regimes actually mean, because they serve so much more of a bigger purpose in society, especially within the anti-obesity approach, in kind of, you know, it's a way to encourage us to monitor and surveillance our lifestyle behaviours. So Goffman, 1963. So Goffman, 1963, supports this in saying that this kind of impression management, so that's impression management, really demonstrates the individual's conformity to societal norms. And it simultaneously helps the individual avoid the anomie that accompanies the possession of a deviant body, or what Foucault would call, you know, a deviant fat body, deviance. So this notion of self-care regimes can actually be linked with Foucault, 1979. Foucault, 1979. Foucault's theory of biopower. So I don't think that biopower has been covered too much in previous lectures at any point, in fact, I think. So this might be new to some of you. But within, to kind of simplify it down and break it down for you, Foucault's theory of biopower says that the body itself, the physical body, can be seen as a site of docile subjugation. And the reference for that is Pylypa, 1998, page 25. So that's Pylypa. Pylypa, 1998, docile subjugation. And what she means here when she talks about docile subjugation. So while we're on the topic of self-regulation and personal responsibility, I want to move on to some real world examples that that hit home with me, because I have used these and it made me think about them really differently. So I guess we'll see if you guys feel the same way. So Lupton, 2018, develops this idea by highlighting how digital self-monitoring has become really, really popular in recent years. And obviously that's bound to happen as the technology sector has gradually, it started to infiltrate and capitalise on this notion of self-care. Schilling, 1993, this idea of self-care, it's infiltrating that, it is capitalised on it, it's seen a gap in the market and thought, yeah, do you know what, we're going to grab that with both hands. So prime examples of this lie with apps like MyFitnessPal, Map My Ride, Map My Walk, Slimming World Online, My Fitness Coach, even with things like Fitbits, Apple Watches. They all work harmoniously and together within this kind of anti-obesity landscape. They all work together to encourage self-blame, self-responsibility, and therefore self-improvement. It's placing the responsibility in our hands by saying, well, look, here's some apps, track your calories, track how much you walk, track your exercise, find new meal ideas, document your weight loss. It's placing the responsibility in our hands through this idea of rigorous digital tracking of food intake and exercise, so without even knowing, I've had MyFitnessPal before. I've lost weight through using MyFitnessPal, and never before did I think, God, that's me participating and engaging with this anti-obesity narrative without me even knowing it. So that's really, really something to think about, especially if any of you use it already. I don't know, I just find it interesting to sit back and think, God, it hits home. And I think that's really important just for sociology in general, just to link it back to your everyday life. Okay, so we've kind of covered individual, personal responsibility for our own bodily state. So I think now it's time to kind of zoom out and take a little bit of a different approach, because, it's not as simple as, placing all the responsibility on the individual. So I want to talk about macro governance of fat bodies. And as you'll probably see from the little icon just here on the screen, this links to Foucault and it can be linked to surveillance. So within the anti-obesity approach, we've already kind of established that the fat body is consistently subjected to various forms of stigmatization. You know, we know that Foucault, 1979, he labels it as deviant, the deviant fat body. It doesn't coincide with societal norms. So, you know, the fat body is subjected to these forms of stigmatization because it's so visually divorced from these cultural norms of slenderness, in addition to kind of, you know, hegemonic Western ideals of beauty. You know, it's nothing like them. It's a completely different ballgame. So, you know, whilst it's already been established that the anti-obesity approach calls for people that embody fat to lose weight, you know, through self-regulation, you know, preventative strategies like reducing food consumption. You know, this is where Lupton 2018 comes in, where she draws on, you know, MyFitnessPal, tracking calories, fitness technology. That's where all of this comes in. So whilst, you know, the anti-obesity approach calls for personal blame and responsibility, it's also fair to take a step back and assume that governance of fat bodies also occurs at a macro level. So that's a macro level, through the implementation of various, you know, government schemes and state policies. So it can be argued that, you know, as we've already kind of talked about, fit, well-regulated bodies, so fit, well-regulated bodies, they fail to place any form of economic burden on society, because, you know, not only do they place less strain on healthcare services like the NHS perhaps, but they also contribute as part of, you know, the strong workforce that the capitalist kind of enterprise relies so heavily on. And, you know, this idea of capitalism that I keep referring back to and having a strong workforce, a really, really good reference to use for this is Hancock et al. 2000. I think I've written it on the slide there. Yes, so Hancock et al. 2000. Really, really good for talking about capitalism, just as like a little extra from the kind of core sociological theorists that you'd use. Just really, really good to add, you know, just to drop that in there, just to prove you've done your research, really. So it's because of this idea that the state takes such an interest in regulating the health of its citizens. You know, it wants a strong workforce. It wants to get as much out of you as an employee, as a worker, as physically possible. And this is why it takes such an interest in regulating it, because it's well aware that not everyone, not the whole population of the planet, is going to be influenced by the media. You know, these messages in the media about, you know, these hegemonic Western ideals of beauty, they're not going to affect everyone. Some people are incredibly thick-skinned. Some people simply don't have access to them. You know, some people live in less economically developed countries where, you know, they're not exposed to the media as much, or these messages in particular. There's cultural differences of beauty as well that come into play here. You know, and the state is increasingly aware of that. So by implementing these kind of government campaigns and policies, they have a way to have a hold over everyone, regardless of how much you are influenced by the media. So obviously you'll see from the slide, one of the best kind of government-sponsored campaigns that I could find was the Change for Life campaign. And this was first introduced in 2009, so again, over 10 years ago now. And this was introduced as part of the government's Healthy Weight, Healthy Lives strategy. So again, it's part of the government's Healthy Weight, Healthy Lives strategy for England. And you can find more information about that strategy on the Department of Health website. But yeah, it was implemented in 2008. And, you know, the Change for Life campaign kind of, again, it glamorizes it. It, you know, it makes it bright and colourful. It makes it attractive to engage with, not only for the eye, but for the mind. You know, it says, oh, you know, it's so easy, you know, do food swaps. Let's all be food smart. You know, just here you can see that's, you know, a frequently used tagline here, or be food smart here. You know, so it's kind of saying, you know, this is easy. Why not? You know, there's a free app. There's a free website. Go and look at it. It's so easy to do. You know? Something I found really, really interesting is that just recently, the Change for Life campaign has actually brought out an app. And this is where this photo here comes in with the cola can. It's an app similar to MyFitnessPal where you can actually scan the barcodes of food in supermarkets and etc. It's kind of aimed at parents, you know, who want healthier swaps for their kids. And, you know, it's an app designed to help them scan it and see how much sugar is in it, how much saturated fat is in it. So, you know, while this was originally a kind of government-sponsored campaign, it does kind of trickle down and infiltrate down and, you know, encourage these ideas of personal tracking and responsibility. You know, so it's that trickle down effect. Started as a government campaign and gradually they've thought, okay, well, cool. Government campaign works, but let's kind of filter down, you know, with this idea of easily accessible health regimes and food swaps and being food smart. And they've given us an app. So again, even though it's a government campaign and we're talking about macro governance, again, we can link it back to individual responsibility. So it's targeted at everyone, the nation, but it's still encouraging you to self-monitor and self-regulate and take personal responsibility and blame. That's really, really important within this perspective. You know, that idea of being personally responsible for embodying fat. That's your problem. That's really, really key for this perspective. So another example, I haven't included it on the slide, but you know, you can bring other government campaigns in, like the introduction of the sugar tax. You know, and again, that's another way for the government to kind of mediate and moderate and surveillance our health. So, you know, it's definitely a really, really interesting way of looking at it. You know, it was only the other day, funnily enough, that I was, you know, on the subject of the cola can on the screen, I said to my mum, God, I cannot remember the last time I managed to find full fat Coke on the shelves of the supermarket. Now, I don't usually drink full fat Coke. I usually drink diet, which I know for many of you probably quite controversial, but it's just really interesting. That narrative, you know, like the sugar tax, moderation of self, surveillance, you know, that's that in play in my daily, everyday life. Not even being able to find full fat Coke on the shelves. It's taken away as an option. People can't engage with it because it's not there in the first place. Macro governance. It all ties together. So, you know, whilst this strategy, you know, this Change for Life campaign, for example, whilst this is a seemingly positive way for people to improve their health with simple means, you know, food swaps, being food smart, you know, it can't be denied that this campaign plays a role in spreading these negative fat-related discourses to the general public. You know, I mean, it's done through encouraging people to kind of sit back and assess their own condition as being too fat. It's encouraging people to sit back and go, you know, like what I said before, or, you know, maybe I could change that, maybe I could be healthier. It's encouraging people to sit back and say, I'm too fat, what am I going to do to change it? And, you know, it encourages people to lose weight. And the idea of weight, overweight, linking back to that use of language that I mentioned at the start, that term overweight that's so frequently used, you know, there's this focus on weight and the kind of aesthetics of the fat body rather than health. You know, this is advertised as a healthy campaign. Let's be food smart. You know, let's change for the better. Let's change for our kids so that they can see how to live a healthy lifestyle and take by example. But, you know, it's kind of, you know, if you step back, what it's really saying is that, you know, you should lose weight. If you're fat, you should lose weight. But it doesn't pay any attention to, you know, well, it doesn't say if you're fat but you have a healthy lifestyle, that's all right. It doesn't say that. It's very, very focused. This approach, the anti-obesity approach, is very focused on the aesthetics of the fat body, and it's significantly positioned itself away from notions of health and well-being because of that. You know, this is seen as a healthy eating campaign, all to do with health. But within this anti-obesity perspective, it's really not about that, because it's encouraging people to lose weight regardless of whether they perhaps already maintain a healthy lifestyle. If you have a healthy lifestyle and you're active and, you know, you get your daily steps in and, you know, you eat healthily and you eat your 5 a day, then what is the problem with carrying a little bit of extra weight, as they would say? It's just an interesting point for consideration there. And it could also be argued that this discourse helps in spreading notions of personal responsibility for not meeting these societal kind of preferences for the thin body ideal. You know, the biomedical approach, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later, but the biomedical approach really, really comes into play here because one of the key criticisms of the anti-obesity perspective comes from the biomedical approach, because it says that the anti-obesity perspective has created a discourse that's more concerned with the aesthetics of the fat body rather than the health and well-being of the individual. You know, it's saying a lot of people who use, you know, apps like we've covered before, like MyFitnessPal, and they track calories, that takes a really serious toll on their mental health. You know, it can play into the development of eating disorders and all these other health concerns. You know, the anti-obesity approach is so concerned with, you know, how being overweight or obese or fat can, you know, lead you to having these health problems, but it doesn't actually pay any attention to how these preventative strategies that are so heavily endorsed, even in government campaigns, you know, it doesn't pay any attention to how they could perhaps impact health and well-being. It's all about aesthetics and weight. So again, this is something I'll definitely cover a little bit more in depth later, and we'll be able to get into a proper discussion about it. But yeah, just a really, really interesting point for consideration there. So before we move on, one last theory I'd like to drop in here. Again, we're going to refer back to Foucault, 1979. And this is a slightly different theory. So before we talked about bipower, but Foucault presents another theory, and Okay, so by this point, we've kind of established that both the state, like the government, and the individual play equal parts in the surveillance of our kind of body conditions. But it is also worth noting that popular media can be seen as a significant kind of extension to this theory of the panopticon that we've already talked about, because similarly to government strategies and state policies, the media has this ability to act as what Foucault, 1979, would say an architectural figure of power and discipline. So in the same way as the government and the strategies that it implements, the media acts as an architectural figure of power and discipline. So what Foucault and this theory of the panopticon is saying is it's kind of levelling out the playing field between the media and the government, and it's basically saying that they have equal responsibility, if you like, or equal power in controlling our bodily conditions and surveillancing us as individuals. So through this, it's saying that, you know, through both the government and the media, the public can be influenced to conform to the societal preference of the normative, thin, well-regulated body. You know, it's influencing us to want to become that way. So it links to what I was saying before about the agent's true desires. Is it a true desire? Or have we just been influenced to think that way? Very, very interesting. Or at least I think it is anyway. So a prime example, and I've provided you a lot of prime examples here. I really, really enjoyed making this slide because I love all of these programs. I'll hold my hands up. But the first one I want to draw your attention to is the popular Netflix series Insatiable. And I believe it was first released to the platform in 2018. So not all of you may have watched this, but I certainly have, and for people who have, it might help. But even just going on Netflix and kind of looking at the trailer or perhaps skimming through the first episode, you'll get a really good idea of what it's about. So just as a brief overview, the series itself follows the story of a young woman named Patty Bladell, and after losing over half her body weight, she has her life transformed and she's kind of flung into this glamorous world of beauty pageants and pageanting. So similarly to, you know, we can kind of relate this to TV shows like The Biggest Loser, which I'm sure way more of you would have heard of or seen. So they're kind of similar because both of them kind of glorify weight loss as this ultimate sign of, you know, it's the ultimate kind of transformation is what they're saying. And a really, really good reference to use here is Hartley, like the jelly, 2001. So Hartley, Hartley, Hartley 2001. And Hartley says that both of these series and similar media glorify weight loss as the ultimate sign of self-discipline and control. So it glorifies weight loss as the ultimate sign of self-discipline and control. It's a really, really important point. So that's how they're similar. So within the anti-obesity perspective, the fat body is often portrayed through shows like this as this kind of repugnant, disgusting display of bodily excess. But not only that, it's seen as an indication of inferiority. and this is something I have a real issue with. This notion is, you know, really demonstrated across series 1 and 2 of Insatiable, but you know, this is fiction. Insatiable is fiction. It's a fictional TV show. It's not based on real life, but this discourse is carried across into the real world, and this is something that really angers me. You know, saying that thinner people are perhaps more valued in society than larger people. I don't agree with it. I'm sure many of you will feel the same. So as I said, this discourse is, you know, carried across into the real world, and an example of this comes from where did I see it? It was written by Derbyshire, 2006. It was an article written for the Telegraph, and within the first paragraph of this article, I was really drawn to a quote, and it said that inside every fat person is a thin person trying to get out. So the Telegraph, 2006. Inside every fat person is a thin person trying to get out. So this kind of implies that the fat body, or just body fat in itself, acts as a prison that entraps the true self. So it's kind of implying that, you know, we can't express our true selves. We can't be considered as being our true selves if we embody fat. And that kind of plays into this idea of thinner, well-regulated citizens being more valued, not perhaps just in capitalist eyes, but in the idea of maybe they're seen as presenting their true self. You know, and as you'll see on the board there, I've included Khloe Kardashian's revenge body. And I'll hold my hands up and say I haven't watched a lot of this TV show. But again, I find it really interesting that, you know, it's this idea of if you lose weight, you know, you're getting revenge on anyone who's ever doubted you, anyone who's said, oh, you can't lose weight, or you're not beautiful, or you're ugly, or anyone who said those things to you. It's this idea that weight loss, this ultimate transformation, you know, is the ultimate way to get revenge on those people. And it's the ultimate way to display your true self and show how disciplined you are. Show how much self-control you have, how much better of a person you are. And there's nothing saying that if you embody fat, you can't be your true self. You can't be disciplined. You can't have self-control. You can, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. You can embody fat and still be disciplined and controlled and a well-regulated person and have a healthy lifestyle, but that's not what these TV shows and series are saying. And that's why they're so closely associated with this anti-obesity approach. So in addition to Foucault's theory of the panopticon, which we've already covered, the work of Merton, 1938, that's Merton, M-E-R-T-O-N, Merton, 1938. His work can also be applied to this study of media representations of fat embodiment, because in his work, Merton notes that the discourse of disgust surrounding the fat body is a tool that's often used by the media to put pressure on individuals to develop thinner, more socially acceptable bodies. So he's saying that, you know, the media is used as a tool by the anti-obesity approach to put pressure on people, make them feel bad, and in turn lose weight and develop a more socially acceptable body. So that's what he's saying. So a prime example of this can be seen in other TV shows like My £600 Life, or as you'll see on the slide there, Super Size versus Super Skinny. So rather than glorifying this process of extreme weight loss, these kind of programs are slightly different. And that's because, you know, instead of kind of glorifying this narrative of extreme weight loss, these shows instead kind of, they seek to document the realities of obese people by demonstrating like the poor lifestyle choices that accompany them, and these notions of excessive desire that accompany this fleshy appearance of the fat body. And a really, really good reference you can use there is Bakhtin, 1965, Bakhtin, Bakhtin, 1965. So, you know, they don't focus so much on, you know, weight loss. They instead seek to shame the viewer in a different way by saying, oh, you know, these lifestyle behaviours, this excessive desire, this excessive consumption of food, and, you know, laziness and whatever else that they portray, these are associated with the fat body. It's almost providing a hypothetical glimpse into the future, and it's kind of saying, oh, you know, if you don't want to end up like this, you better self-regulate and you better change. So again, linking back to that idea of self-regulation, surveillance, monitoring, it's really, really important. So in addition to the kind of content of the show, if we just kind of step away from that for a minute, the title image of the show, I'm just going to kind of hover my mouse over it, if you can see that, on the Super Size versus Super Skinny. It kind of depicts the fat body in a negative light as well, even though it has larger people and skinnier people in the title screen. You know, it kind of picks bits and pieces of people's bodies, and this links back to a theory mentioned by Joe in a few lectures back by Cooper, 2007. So that's C-O-O-P-E-R, Cooper, 2007. Headless fatties. It's a horrible word to say, but that is what he theorises. He says that this headless fatty form of imagery transforms the body into a depersonalised object. So Cooper says that this headless fatty form of imagery transforms the body into a depersonalised object. And this depersonalised object can therefore be shamed by the general public without guilt or consequence. Now, obviously this isn't the case. You should never feel okay about, you know, bullying somebody over the way that they look, or thinking anyone's less of a person because they perhaps weigh more than you or embody more fat than you. But, you know, what Cooper is really trying to say here is that, you know, by splitting up these body parts, it kind of takes you away from who the person really is. It doesn't make you see them as a person with feelings and emotions. It makes you see them as a part of a body, an object. And it's because of that that people feel so fine with, you know, saying, oh, that's disgusting, oh, that's horrible, oh, I don't find that attractive, because they're just looking at an object, a part of a body, rather than a person. And that's really what Cooper is trying to say here with this headless fatty theory. there's a really, really good study that I read about not too long ago, and it's just popped into my head, and I think, do you know what, it would be really, really great to drop this in as a reference. It's Holland et al. 2011. Holland, Holland, Holland et al. 2011, and he did a study that looked at the language that people used when looking at this headless fatty kind of form of imagery on billboards in the streets. So, you know, he observed the way that people spoke about this kind of imagery that was on these billboards, and with billboards that encompassed, you know, headless fatty forms of imagery, you know, the body with a head cut off, or, you know, just parts of a body, you know, this kind of imagery was usually accompanied with really negative vocalized expressions like flabby, lazy, gross, disgusting, and people saying all these, you know, attaching all these really negative connotations to that piece of imagery. So this study really kind of reinforces the clear kind of divide between desirable bodies, and fat bodies. So it's really, again, this is what this anti-obesity approach is trying to do. It's trying to kind of draw a very clear, irremovable line between this is a okay, socially acceptable, thin, well-regulated citizen, and this is a deviant, non-normative, unacceptable fat body. So there is a clear distinction, and this is what all of these approaches, self-regulation, macro-governance, media portrayals, this is what they're all trying to say. They all work together to form this narrative of what is okay and what isn't. And that's really, really important. So I think it's really, really important. You probably would have heard from the things I've been saying that I have a real issue with this anti-obesity approach. So I'm going to kind of move our attention on now to a slightly different perspective. I'm going to start talking about the biomedical critique. And I loved looking at this. I really love getting my teeth into kind of criticising and comparing theory. This is why I really, really liked this. So the biomedical paradigm surrounding fat embodiment is often used in critiquing this dominant anti-obesity discourse. And that is because, well, that is for many, many reasons, some of which we mentioned earlier. But one of the most prominent reasons that this biomedical paradigm critiques the anti-obesity approach is because it fails to use accurate scientific claims. And the reference for that is Lupton, 2013, as you'll see on the slide there. So if we just stop for a second, you might be sat there thinking, well, hang on, Abby, you told us before that the anti-obesity approach, it's positivist, it objectively documents these problems with the fat body, it uses statistics, it uses this term obesity epidemic. What are you chatting about? And you would be completely right in thinking that, because the anti-obesity approach does use scientific claims and statistics, you know, like that one about COVID-19, obesity increases risk by 50%. It's very numerical. And that in itself is what the biomedical critique zooms in on, because it says that, yes, it's very numerical, but it's almost used as a persuasive technique. It seeks to distort medical data in order to get a point across to the general public. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that these media outlets are deliberately making up statistics to make it look really, really bad. That's not what they're doing. It's a lot more intricate and it's very multi-layered. But essentially, if I give you an example, it'll perhaps demonstrate this a little bit better. But a primary example of this is it's a article published by The Guardian, and I've included a little screen grab just at the bottom here for you. It was written by Campbell 2019, and it's titled "Obesity Almost Doubles in 20 Years to Affect 13 Million People." So obesity almost doubles in 20 years to affect 13 million people. So the critical biomedical perspective kind of highlights that this like numerical terminology, like doubled or tripled, is often used within this anti-obesity discourse, particularly in the media aspect of it, to amplify this gradual increase in body weight over time. And this is supported by Campos et al. 2006. So Campos, C-A-M-P-O-S, Campos et al. 2006. And he says that, you know, this numerical terminology, like doubled and tripled, it's used to almost overgeneralize and kind of over-exaggerate this idea of obesity becoming an increasing problem. But what Campos says is that people are actually only 3 to 5 kilograms heavier than a generation ago. And Campos highlights that this slight increase in weight over time is just enough to tip a lot of people from overweight to obese on the BMI scale. So even though it's a very, very slight increase in weight, you know, it's enough to just tip people into that slightly worse category. And it's because of this that headlines like doubling of obesity rates, tripling of obesity rates, it's because of this that these phrases can be used across various media platforms, because it's not necessarily incorrect. If we really look at the technicalities, yes, it's technically accurate. Maybe it has doubled. But by using that terminology, doubled, tripled, it makes it seem so much worse than it is. And that's the whole point. It's, you know, fear-mongering, scare tactics. That's the whole point. So additionally, the tendency of the anti-obesity approach to solely focus its attention towards the aesthetics of the fat body, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this focus on the aesthetics and the look of the fat body has led the anti-obesity approach to be really distanced from notions of health and well-being. And this can, the reference you can use for that is O'Hara and Taylor 2018. It's just written on the slide just here. So, you know, they're saying that it's too focused on the look of the fat body rather than how healthy the individual is. You know, they might be carrying a few extra pounds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they sit on the sofa all day gorging on crisps and chocolate. Do you see what I mean? So that's what O'Hara and Taylor are essentially saying. And it's really interesting that that is the case, because obviously they utilise a lot of medical data in its consistent kind of fear-mongering regime. So it's really interesting that it is actually so distanced away from notions of health and well-being, despite using all this medical data, being so objective and taking on that positivist approach. It's very, very interesting. So Lupton 2013 supports this in pointing out that this anti-obesity discourse has helped to create and reproduce an adiphobo. So if we just take a little bit of a step back now, I've just skipped forward a few slides, can't talk. Yes, I've just skipped forward a few slides. So if we just take a step back. So at this point, we just reflect. We've established that fear-mongering, macro governance, and derogatory multimedia portrayals of fatness all work together within the anti-obesity paradigm in an attempt to pressure individuals to achieve these socially acceptable goals of slenderness, right? So, you know, although this is a seemingly negative development, Goffman, 1963, so that's Goffman 1963, it's at the top of the slide there. Goffman points out that agents react to this form of societal pressure in 3 different ways. So again, that idea of societal pressure, we can link it back to Merton earlier, ideas of societal pressure, pressuring the individual to change. So yeah, agents can react to it in 3 different ways. I'm going to talk you through each of them. So the first one is said to be neutralisation. And the idea of neutralisation is where basically the individual refuses to accept any responsibility for their bodily condition, and they often claim that it's natural and healthy. Crossley, 2004, this is a really, really good reference. Crossley, C-R-O-S-S-L-E-Y, Crossley, 2004. And Crossley points out that this neutralisation reaction is really closely associated with biochemical kind of shortcuts to obtaining a socially desirable body. So again, Crossley, biochemical shortcuts. And what I mean by biochemical shortcuts is things like liposuction or plastic surgery. Now, again, if we think back to a few lectures ago, Joe took a really, really good lecture on plastic surgery. I really, really enjoyed it, but we can kind of link these together. So Joe mentioned a study, I think it was Morgan 91, Morgan 91, M-O-R-G-A-N. And Morgan says that the cosmetic industry is dominated by men. So top surgeons are male. There's an increasing amount of male domination in that field. So again, we could get into a discussion here, if it was relevant, about the male gaze, about male domination. We could talk about feminism. You know, liberal feminists may argue that, you know, it's not an issue if it makes the person feel confident, but then radical or Marxist feminists would perhaps make a play on the idea of male domination. So, you know, that's definitely something that you could delve into with this through talk about these biochemical shortcuts to obtaining a more desirable body. Like, you could definitely delve into a discussion about that. But also you could talk about globalization. And this is something I'm going to come on to a little bit shortly. So we will refer back to this idea of globalization. But, you know, if we think about it, we're talking about this idea of you know, obesogenic society where we're focusing on the aesthetics of the fat body rather than health and well-being. You know, once this society has been achieved, capitalism, like the attention of a capitalist society, is now focused on the global market of fixing insecurities and how they can capitalize on that. So there's a global market for these biochemical shortcuts and plastic surgery. So globalization, another really interesting route that you could go down if you're thinking about including this in your assignment. So if we just move on to the second reaction theorised by Goffman. So the second reaction is assumed to be the acceptance of responsibility. And this is an approach through which the individual adopts healthier lifestyle habits to combat obesity. So they've taken personal responsibility and they're adopting measures to help themselves become healthier and achieve a more socially acceptable body. So you could argue that, you know, agents that have this kind of acceptance of responsibility attitude, they're perhaps victims of the anti-obesity perspective. You know, the perspective that encourages tracking and monitoring and surveillance and self-blame. So, you know, you always got to look at it through a critical eye. So the final, and what I think is the most interesting kind of reaction, is the pride response. And this pride response is where agents, they individually or collectively, so they can do it on their own, they can do it in a group, they challenge the negative discourses that the anti-obesity response heavily endorses. So, you know, they challenge them notions of disgust and deviance. Again, Foucault, deviance. You know, they challenge them. And this movement leads me on to the next perspective, the other polar opposite end of the scale, the health at every size movement, or as I'm going to call it, the body positivity movement. So if we skip a slide here, body positivity movement. So this movement, obviously, it's often categorised as the health at every size movement, and this was first theorised by Linda Bacon, 2010. It's just at the top of the slide there, Linda Bacon, 2010. And this health at every size kind of body positivity movement, it directly contrasts this increasingly dominant anti-obesity perspective on fatness. And this is because it claims that possessing a fat body and being healthy are not mutually exclusive. So having a fat body and being healthy are not mutually exclusive. You can have both at the same time. This is really, really key for this body positivity perspective. So in other words, good health and physical fitness are achievable despite body size. So you can be fit and you can be healthy regardless of your weight, is what the body positivity movement says. And Bacon, Linda Bacon, 2010, says that this is achievable because we all have an internal system designed to keep us healthy. So we have an internal system designed to keep us healthy. That's really important. So this kind of notion emphasises the core belief system of the health at every size movement, because it really sheds a light on the importance of maintaining a healthy lifestyle rather than straining the body with restrictive dieting and exhaustive exercise routines. You know, so the health at every size, or the body positivity movement, whatever you want to refer to it as, it's really saying sod off to all the, you know, like the MyFitnessPal, the tracking the calories, the tracking the exercise. It's just completely writing that off, and it's saying we all have this internal system that keeps us healthy, you know, so we don't need to worry about tracking calories and tracking everything we eat and doing loads of really, really exhaustive exercise routines like those you'd perhaps see in Khloe Kardashian's revenge body that we talked about earlier. You don't have to worry about those. As long as you maintain a healthy lifestyle, that's fine. And that is what this approach is focused on. So additionally, it can be argued that the health at every size movement also challenges the anti-obesity perspective through shedding a more positive light on the aesthetics of the fat body, rather than engaging in fat-shaming discourses. So, you know, it's this idea that we talked about earlier, where, you know, the anti-obesity perspective is really focused on the aesthetics of the fat body, but in a negative light. And this is where the body positivity movement comes in, because what they're trying to say is, well, you know, why should this be seen as disgusting or not good enough? Like, why is this the socially accepted norm about the fat body? Let's glamorize it, let's normalize it. You know, not everyone looks the way people do in the magazines. Not even people in the magazines look like the people in the magazines. So again, they're changing the narrative around the aesthetics of the fat body. So whilst the body positivity movement seems like a really positive development, and in many ways it is, there are criticisms that are pointed towards it. So a really, really good reference for this is Brady and Gingras 2013. So Brady, B-R-A-D-Y, Brady and Gingras, G-I-N-G-R-A-S, Brady and Gingras 2013. And they point out that this kind of preoccupation with physical health as being the primary focus for the definition and, you know, for the achievement of well-being kind of paints an incomplete picture of what it means to be healthy. So what they're basically saying is that the health at every size movement, it's increasingly, you know, even though it's saying about, you know, we all have this internal system to keep us healthy, it's still focusing on maintaining a healthy lifestyle. And this criticism by Brady and Gingras can either be known as healthism. So healthism. So you could say, if you were arguing it in writing, you say it's criticised for adopting healthist tendencies. So this kind of focus on physical health aids the creation of what Ferguson 2012 calls perfect fatty syndrome. Again, really, really hate the terminology, but that is just what it's called. It's perfect fatty syndrome. And in this kind of perfect fatty syndrome, people believe that in order to advocate for the health at every size movement, in order to advocate for this body positivity narrative, that they have to have a perfect record of physical health. Because if you take a step back and think, well, you can't really be advertising this body positivity movement as a plus size person if you are then suffering with all of the medical conditions that the anti-obesity perspective says that you're bound to have as an obese person. So, you know, what Ferguson is saying here is that, you know, people feel like, you know, if they have all of these kind of demonized health problems that the anti-obesity perspective has told people, you know, these are associated with obesity, then people are left sat there questioning, well, if I have these, how could I possibly advocate for body positivity and saying, oh, we all have a system inside ourselves to keep us healthy? How can I sit there and say that if I'm living proof that this internal system hasn't worked because I have these health issues? So Ferguson, we're drawing on Ferguson again here. Ferguson's later work, a year later, Ferguson 2013, kind of argues against this creation of perfect fatty syndrome. So he basically sits there and says, everybody, whether fat or thin, obese or slender, whoever you are, everyone gets sick. And anybody can be affected by inherited diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure. Anyone can be affected by those regardless of body size, which is true. And I mean, I don't know if anybody else in the class suffers with these health issues, but I know myself, at my most slender, at my thinnest, I suffered with high blood pressure issues. So, you know, these problems that the anti-obesity perspective draws attention to, like diabetes and things like that, they're not inherently associated with the fat body. They can happen to anybody. And this is what Ferguson says. Everyone gets sick, anyone can be impacted by these. So this demonstrates how our changing condition of health shouldn't impact the expression of our beliefs. You know, so even if you have these medical problems, that doesn't mean that you can't advocate for body positivity. It doesn't mean that you can't advocate for health at every size and this idea of having an internal system. Because quite frankly, the general public, I mean, the only person that's going to know whether that is inherently caused by you embodying excess fat is going to be your doctor. So what Ferguson is saying is, who is anybody to tell you you can't advocate for health at every size if you have these problems, because they can affect anyone, skinny or fat. So that's what he's saying. This is quite a complex kind of criticism. I'm going to expand on it again in a minute, just to give you a bit more of an in-depth idea. But if anybody does have any issues with this or wants it explained further, please don't hesitate to contact me. I am going to have my email at the end. So if you do struggle with this idea of healthism and you don't quite get it, please do just drop me an email. I'm happy to have a call or join the online learning space and chat you through it if anybody needs to. So let's expand on this idea of healthism a little bit, because again, it is quite complex. And yeah, I don't know if perhaps you're understanding it in the way that I put it before. So let's just talk about it a little bit. So we've already established that the health at every size body positivity movement does adopt a few healthist tendencies. There are a few encompassed in that. That's undeniable. But Crawford, C-R-A-W-F-O-R-D, Crawford, 1980, claims that the whole concept of healthism can be much more heavily associated with the beliefs encompassed within the anti-obesity perspective. So, you know, it's way more heavily associated with the other end of the spectrum when it comes to fat embodiment. And this notion is supported by Crawford's later writing. So Crawford et al., same spelling, Crawford et al., 2015. And these writings point out that good health is now being used as one of the primary means of measuring an individual's value as both a person and a citizen. So Crawford et al., 2015. The reason that healthism is more associated with the anti-obesity perspective is because it's being used as a means of measuring an individual's value as both a person and a citizen. So this ties back in with what I was saying earlier. You know, the anti-obesity perspective says, you know, if you're fat, if you're obese, you're going to have all these health problems, and then you're not going to be as valued as a member of society because you can't contribute as well to the workforce. You're not as valued. So again, it's that means, health is used as a means of measuring someone's value in a capitalist society. So this suggests that, kind of similarly to Giddens' notions of the body project, that's Giddens 1991, mentioned it earlier, the body project. So similarly to that, health has kind of evolved into a personal project or hobby that we can judge others for not taking up. So this reinforces them notions of personal blame that are so heavily endorsed within the anti-obesity paradigm. You know, because what Ferguson is saying here is that your health is a personal project, like a body project. You work on it over time. So if it's a personal project, naturally it stands to reason that if your personal project isn't going well, and perhaps you've gained a little bit of weight, you know, particularly over lockdown as well, this really, really links to like contemporary issues in society. You know, if your personal project isn't going too well, then obviously this reinforces these notions of you being to blame. So yeah, it really, really links with the anti-obesity perspective. So in contrast to this, the body positivity approach coins a more constructionist view on the embodiment of excess body fat. So it doesn't look at the role of the individual as much. So we've established that the anti-obesity paradigm really plays into this idea of personal monitoring and blame, right? So on the other end of the spectrum, the body positivity approach, we're looking at a more social constructionist view. We're looking at, you know, what are the environmental, societal, socioeconomic influences that have an impact on our bodily state. You know, it's not just about our role as the individual. We have to look at wider society, and this is something that the anti-obesity perspective fails to do. So this moves me on quite nicely to talking about globalization and social class differences. So I said earlier I'd be coming back to this. So this relates back to what I was talking about earlier. So body positivity scholars, or health at every size scholars, however you want to refer to them, they argue that the anti-obesity perspective is a retaliation against our transition into an obesogenic society. An obesogenic society. And the reference for that is Brunstrom and Cheon, 2018. So BRUNSTROM, Brunstrom and Cheon, CHEON. Brunstrom and Cheon, 2018, obesogenic society. So advocates for the body positivity movement are saying that the anti-obesity perspective is a retaliation against this. So let's kind of delve into what an obesogenic society is. So Brunstrom and Cheon say that an obesogenic society is an environment where obesity is an easily achievable state. So obesity is an easily achievable state due to the rapid invasion of Western lifestyle habits. So this could link back, you could link it back to what we said earlier about this idea of risk society, Beck. You know, everyone is at risk of becoming obese. And, you know, it's, you know, becoming obese, everyone's at risk of it because it's easily achievable. And this is due to the invasion of Western lifestyle habits. So if we take a step back, what do we mean by Western lifestyle habits? So it could be argued that an example of Western lifestyle habits could be globalization. You know, if we think about a British high street, just a typical British high street, you know, we might have a few shops down there, perhaps a Boots or a pharmacy or whatever, but the majority of our British high streets, you know, they've become this kind of utopia of multicultural cuisine from all over the world. You know, even if we think about something as stereotypical as the traditional English breakfast, tea, grown in all different parts of the world, sausages, Germany, you know. So it's just very, very interesting to kind of link it back to things that we would see in everyday life. You know, so this emergence of the fast food industry is an example of an invasion of Western lifestyle habits. So obviously, as we're talking about globalization, and obviously in a minute we're going to be moving on to social class differences, you'll see at the bottom here, I've put 3 little pictures in, and they're of little delivery people. So we've got Just Eat, Uber Eats and Deliveroo, and I've put these in because I want to drop in another little bit of theory for you that you can kind of use in this argument for globalization. So we've kind of talked about how globalization has led to you know, this massive growth in the fast food industry, but it's also led to growth in, you know, extensions of that kind of fast food business landscape. And something I wanted to talk to you about here is this idea of the gig economy. And the reference that you can use for this is Stewart and Stanford. Stewart and Stanford. And I've just got the names up on the screen here. So the gig economy is responsible for the creation of these kind of convenience-based businesses. So, you know, like Deliveroo and Uber Eats, which is why I've put their pictures at the bottom there. And, you know, these are extensions to that fast food business landscape. You know, I could sit here right now and I could order whatever I wanted on my phone. It would take me 2 minutes and I could have any food I wanted, Chinese, Indian, even something as simple as McDonald's. It could be here at my door in less than an hour, if that. So that really kind of supports this idea of this obesogenic society. Because, you know, we're talking about how obesity is an easily achievable state. And obviously businesses like Deliveroo and Uber Eats, you know, they're based on convenience. You don't have to drive out and go and get that yourself. You can have it delivered straight to your front door. So, you know, that's just a point to think about. And in fact, there was a really, really interesting article on the news recently about the gig economy. Obviously, the gig economy is characterised, well, it is characterised by the notion that the job itself is a gig. A lot of people don't do it full time. A lot of people do it, you know, after work, in the evenings, in their spare time, just to earn a little bit of extra cash. But there's been a lot of issues circulating the media at the moment saying, you know, kind of criticising these businesses for not providing a suitable minimum wage, or, you know, these kind of 0-hour contract jobs don't really give the people working for these companies any security. So that perhaps isn't something that you could link to your assignment for this topic in particular, but it's definitely something to bear in mind. You know, just when you're thinking about the gig economy in general, it's always good to keep thinking back to these real world examples, you know, just kind of grounding it in real life. And I think that's part of what I find so interesting about sociology. So as we move on, you know, we've kind of covered globalization, but the body positivity perspective also sheds a light on the relationship between fatness and social class. And a really, really good reference that you can use for this is Bourdieu, 1987. So I've got the reference just up on the screen there. So BOURDIEU. And what Bourdieu describes here is how health and lifestyle behaviours differ according to social class distinction. And this is because high socioeconomic groups, you know, the higher classes, tend to differentiate themselves from the lower socioeconomic groups by adopting what's known as a culinary taste. Culinary taste. And they often do this through the means of cultural capital. So if we just step back for a second, what we mean by that, obviously the higher classes, I know that the whole class system is fairly outdated in its own right, but if we kind of zoom in on it a little bit, you know, they're going to have more expendable income, so they're going to be able to invest their extra money or their time into things like, you know, gym memberships, juice cleanses, healthy organic food from maybe more upmarket supermarkets, or you know, some people, I know a lot of celebrities these days, I see it on Instagram all the time, they tend to invest in these meal prep companies where they will literally send you loads of freezer meal prepped healthy calorie counted meals. So you know, they have the means to do that, they have the money to invest in these things, whereas, you know, the lower social classes don't. I mean, it's a sad reality that unfortunately healthy food these days, I can guarantee you, if I was to go to the shop and I was to get a big pot of fresh fruit and loads of organic stuff, it would cost me a lot more than it would to get a cheeseburger and fries from McDonald's, which is really, really interesting. So, you know, that's what we kind of mean by this culinary taste and this differentiation between social classes. A really, really good reference, I haven't put it on the board, but there's a study by a theorist called Drewnowski, 2012 I think it is, and the spelling for that is Drewnowski, Drewnowski, 2012. And in his study, I can't remember the specific facts and figures that he documents, but he basically demonstrates that obesity rates are significantly higher amongst population groups with the highest poverty rates and the least emphasis on education. So again, if you want to link that back to other areas of sociology, you can talk about delayed gratification, instant gratification. But you know, so he's saying that obesity rates are higher amongst these population groups, and this study alone really kind of proves and demonstrates how the correlation between lack of cultural capital and obesity is, quite honestly, it's undeniable. So that can be a really, really good reference that you can chuck in there if you just want to expand on that point a little bit more. You know, I definitely recommend that you look that up because it's a really, really good study that you can use. So let's move on to what I wanted to talk to you about next. So I want to talk to you about how social media is used as a tool for empowerment. So when we're talking about social media, one key theorist that should undeniably be taken into consideration if this is what you're going to be talking about in your assignments especially, you're really going to want to look into Lupton. So Lupton, 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 probably 2016 and 2018 I'd say, because in her work she really looks at the correlation between social media and technology, and portrayals of fat embodiment, you know, and she gives really, really good real world examples, and her work is really easily digestible as well, so really easy read but totally worth the time. And she often refers to these forms of technology as socio-cultural artifacts, and she talks about how, you know, these socio-cultural artifacts, so things like social media, smartwatches, Fitbits, even mobile phones and laptops, she talks about how they all work together to play a really active role in the configuration and reproduction of these dominant norms and assumptions about the size of human bodies. So they really work to reinforce those norms of slenderness and the thin body ideal that we mentioned earlier on. So if I link this back to an area that I'm sure everybody in the class is going to know what I'm talking about, let's just talk about meme culture. You know, those funny pictures and sometimes videos that you see circulating the internet, usually, you know, Instagram, sometimes Facebook, whatever it might be. You know, this emergence of meme culture, as well as, you know, websites like Instagram perhaps, or Pinterest, these have really assisted portrayals of fat embodiment to become really highly visual in online spaces. And the reference for that is Lupton 2013, so slightly earlier on. So although Lupton's work tends to kind of acknowledge how images and videos are used, like she often focuses on how they're used to shame and ridicule obese people. This is something she talks a lot about in her work. I think in particular she draws on how on things like Instagram or sometimes YouTube, you'll have like compilation videos that include quite derogatory commentary and things like that, or imagery or silly dances of fat people. So she really kind of hones in on that. But in turn, if we sit back, we can use this as a criticism for her work, because essentially she's kind of failing to acknowledge the ways that the media is used to spread messages of self-empowerment and positivity. So she's failing to kind of acknowledge that in some of her work. So a really, really good example that I want to draw your attention to is the Adipositivity Project. So the Adipositivity Project. And this is a photography program that's only been released in recent years, actually, and it aims, and the aim of it, this is a really, really good quote that you can use. So the aim of the photography program is to promote the acceptance of human size variation. So to promote the acceptance of human size variation. And they do this through advertising really professional and highly aesthetic shots of plus size people across their platforms. So, you know, this can really, really be used to, if we think back to a few lectures ago where Jo was covering fat embodiment, she kind of touched on that. She talked about a really, really cool theorist. His name is Cooper, 2007. I've got the reference on the board there, but in case you're just making notes, that's COOPER, Cooper, 2007. And we can refer this back to that headless, fatty form of imagery that tends to dominate these mainstream media portrayals of overweight people. So, you know, we talked about this earlier when we were discussing media portrayals of the fat body, particularly super size versus super skinny, that idea of kind of segmenting the body and dehumanizing it. So it's not seen as a person with feelings or emotions, it's just seen as a part of a body. That's headless, fatty form of imagery. So we can definitely link it back to that. So in addition to kind of eliminating this grotesque kind of headless, fatty depiction of fat people that seems to be really dominant in the anti-obesity perspective, the body positivity paradigm is also concerned with promoting bodily acceptance and sexual desirability at any size. And I really, really found this interesting because, you know, the anti-obesity perspective kind of perpetuates the notion that sex is a realm only occupied by slender people. So, thinking back to fat being a cage or a prison for the true self, it's also kind of a barrier to becoming a sexual being. And the reference for that is Orbach, 1978. Orbach, Orbach, 1978. This can really link back to one of Jo's previous lectures. I think it was the second lecture, so the Sociology of Sex. If you go back in your notes, I'm sure you would have made notes about this already. Jo was talking about how capitalism harnesses sex to sell goods. So women are draped over anything and everything in adverts to sell things, even some, think about cars or perfume, that's a really good one, or even something as silly as the Lynx Africa advert, or just the Lynx adverts in general, where he sprays it and all of a sudden he becomes irresistible to women. So in many ways, this kind of unnecessary sexual content, sex sells, and it's frequently used in the media. But what I find really, really interesting, this idea of sexual identity and consumer culture, it's very, very in line with the anti-obesity perspective, because I can't think of the last time I saw a plus size person in those advertisements. So these movements like the Adipositivity Project, they recognise this. And the body positivity approach recognises this. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to take these online spaces, advertising, media, social media, online platforms, they're trying to take them and turn them into a kind of equal playing field that isn't just dominated by these kind of normative, slender bodies. We're also trying to get other pictures out there to kind of normalise bodies that don't look like that, whether they're, plus size or maybe just a little bit different to that extremely slender normative body. Like Jess Megan here on the screen, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. She, I wouldn't even say she's plus size necessarily. I mean, she looks fairly normal to me. I don't know, maybe some of you might think differently, but it's just all about normalising normal, average bodies. I don't feel like we get enough of that in the media, and that's why I really, really like focusing on this approach. So, we've kind of established that the body positivity paradigm, it's all about bodily acceptance and sexual desirability at any size. So let's talk a little bit more about this model that I've just mentioned, Jess Megan, because she is a really, really good example. If you're not familiar with her, I mean, I'd suggest looking up her Instagram page. I mean, it only takes a second. But failing that, if you really don't know who it is and you don't want to look it up, I'd say maybe link it back to other more famous people that you might be aware of. So maybe Tess Holliday or Ashley Graham, perhaps. She's great. Lizzo, Rebel Wilson, although I know that she's recently undergone a bit of a weight loss transformation, so you can link it back to other people as well. It's not just her. But the reason that I've picked Jess Megan is because she really does hone in on this idea of sexual desirability at any size. And she engages in collaborations with a lot of sexual wellness brands and lingerie brands. And she does this in order to demonstrate how you can still own your sexuality even if you exist in a body that isn't often portrayed as ideal. And that's a direct. So what we can really link this back to, again, if we link it back to lesson 2, the sociology of sex, Jo talked about the idea of a social script. She said that we are actors, we have scripts, and we learn our scripts from our community. And a really, really good book I've taken a little look at it, and I really suggest that you do as well if this is going to be something that you're going to talk about. Mike Break, Human Sexual Relations, really, really good book. And there's a chapter in there on two theorists called Gagnon and Simon. Gagnon and Simon. So the spelling for that is Gagnon and Simon, Simon. Gagnon and Simon. And what Gagnon and Simon argue is that you become sexual in the same way that you become anything else. So you learn it from your culture, from cues. You know, you learn what is spoken and unspoken, and we kind of sit back and we kind of quietly gather information on how to conduct our bodies within society. You know, so this really links back to this idea of, you know, sexuality, because by not being inclusive, and this can link to other social problems as well as body fat, but in the context of body fat, by not being inclusive and by making, you know, the porn industry or the media really saturated with this thin body ideal, this is kind of making people learn that being fat isn't okay. You know, it's making, you know, from the culture, from the cues, and, you know, we're gathering info on how to conduct our bodies within society. So if we're constantly exposed to this kind of advertising or pornographic content or other messages in the media that all say being fat isn't okay, you know, that's going to lead to quite a lot of problems for the individual. You know, if we're talking about conducting our bodies within society, that could perhaps cause really, you know, serious, you know, things like body dysmorphia, body confidence issues, even things like body language. You know, if you might feel embarrassed of your body, you may feel, you know, embarrassed that you're taking up space. You know, it's that talk about spaces and places of fat bodies. You know, again, linking back to that idea of the master status by Goffman, you know, bringing it back, colonization of future life worlds. That master status gives you scaffolding on which you hang other elements of yourself. You know, so the crucial aspects of your identity from, you know, other people's perspective, they're going to look at that master status. You know, if you think about that kind of scaffolding analogy, if you see scaffolding outside of a building, perhaps they're going to, you know, make it bigger or whatever. You're not going to look at every little nut and bolt and piece of wood or, you know, everything that's on that scaffolding. You're just going to see it as one big structure, you know, and that's what Gagnon and Simon are really playing on, and Goffman as well. The fat is seen as your master status. So, you know, that's something to consider. So this idea about learning that the body that you have isn't desirable, you know, we've talked a little bit about body language and self-talk, but, you know, we can also link it back to these notions of psychology that have been discussed in previous lectures. I want to say that it was the lesson on plastic surgery when we spoke about this, but I could be wrong. But if you go back in your notes, you know, I just want to quickly talk about self-esteem. particularly in women. So I remember Joe talking about how women have notoriously low self-esteem, which in turn sometimes propels them down the cosmetic surgery route. So this links back to what we said earlier about different responses to the anti-obesity perspective, you know, that idea of biochemical shortcuts. Definitely link it back to that. But there's a real debate going on here about this kind of insecurity. So, you know, psychologists like Freud, for example, he would say that insecurity stems from lacking a penis envy, that we've spoken about in other lectures. But sociology, unlike psychology, sociology points to a more social constructionist view. And this is where the media comes in, and globalization and social class, and that idea of an obesogenic environment. These things all have nothing to do with yourself and your actions. You know, the anti-obesity approach is quick to say, oh, it's your problem. You need to fix it. You need to change your lifestyle behaviours. But, you know, sociology as a whole and the anti-obese and the body positivity approach, definitely looks at things that are out of the individual's control. And we can really link this this idea of the media back to Buxton, 2008, mentioned in the plastic surgery lecture. Buxton, 2008, like the water, Buxton. And Buxton analysed the media and the way that women's bodies were portrayed. And you know, they're often portrayed as slim, big busted, but with a narrow waist, but a big bum, bigger thighs, you know, a curvaceous figure. And again, that links back to what we're talking about with sexuality and the media, and how advertising and porn are realms occupied by people that embody that hegemonic Western ideal of feminine beauty. So, you know, that's a really good link that you could make there. And it could also stem into a conversation about feminism and masculinity, especially if you're going to be talking about cosmetic surgery. You know, it's that discussion of, you know, men dominate in that area of expertise. Talk about the male gaze as well. That could be something that you could mention. So if I bring you back to what we were talking about and just kind of bring it back to this lecture. So it's because of all this negativity that sprouts from the anti-obesity perspective that the body positivity narrative encourages this hypersexualization of the fat body. And interestingly, this is often done within the kink community or BDSM community through sexual fetishes like feederism. I mean, I watched a documentary about this recently. I cannot remember for the life of me what it was called. But I'll perhaps try and find it and find the link for you because it was amazing. But so according to Bestard, 2008, so I've got the link just here, Bestard, 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 2008. So according to Bestard, feederism refers to a sexual interest in which individuals become aroused by the notion of gaining weight or encouraging others to gain weight through excessive lifestyle habits. So this can be things like, you know, excessive laziness or excessive eating. That's often one that you see in feederism videos, excessive eating. So, you know, despite this kind of fetish being a demonstration of how fat people are becoming increasingly accepted as sexual beings, so like what Orbach said earlier, 1978, Orbach, sexual beings. So, you know, despite this fetish being a prime example of how fat people are being seen as sexual beings, you could argue that the kind of stigmatization of this fetish, you know, the negative connotations that surround it, you know, a lot of people might think it's weird. In addition to the kind of underground nature of that kink BDSM fetish community, you know, this highlights the kind of deviant and non-normative connotations surrounding fat embodiment. So although this is a good example of, hey, you know, plus size people are being seen as sexual, you know, this is a fetish that is kind of hidden away. It's not the kind of thing that you're going to see on, you know, the front page of a porn website. It's kind of, the best way I can describe it to you is it's there for the people who want to find it, but it's hidden away from those who don't. So it's not just put out there for everyone to see, like there is a space and a place for it. So it's readily available to find online if that's what you're into, but it's not widely advertised to the general public. So again, that kind of highlights the deviance, sorry, you know, surrounding fat embodiment and sexuality. So we're still kind of not getting there. So on the topic of these, you know, on the topic of sexual desirability and the fetishization of fat, I want to draw your attention to a real world example of how, you know, how this is played out in online spaces. So I think a really, really good example to use here is the mukbang and 10,000 calorie challenges that seem to have dominated the YouTube platform in particular. I'm sure if any of you watch YouTube videos or YouTubers frequently, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But for those of you who don't, so the mukbang challenge actually originated from Korea, and it's now become insanely popular all over the world. So it basically refers to the trend of filming a video in which the host consumes large quantities of food whilst interacting with their audience. And the best reference that you can use for this is Matthews 2019. So that's Matthews 2019. Matthews, Matthews. So I'd say an important point for consideration with these is, you know, these videos are obviously not usually created for pornographic or sexual enjoyment purposes. Obviously, YouTube is a very heavily moderated video sharing platform, so stands to reason that that kind of content wouldn't be able to be promoted. In fact, these videos are actually often created for the enjoyment of the ASMR community. And for those of you who don't know what ASMR means, it stands for Autonomous Resensory Meridian Response. So that's Autonomous Resensory Meridian Response. And obviously that's quite a complex set of terminology there, but it basically, the long and short of it is, people in the ASMR community, they watch ASMR videos to try and relax. So they often find that the sounds in the video or the visual aspects of the video are just really, really relaxing. A lot of people report that watching these videos gives them a lovely kind of tingly sensation in the back of their heads, and it helps them fall asleep at night. So I'm sure a lot of you might have heard of these already. But you know, so a lot of people in the ASMR community love these mukbang videos because obviously it sounds a bit gross, but the sound of chewing or the sound of you know, mixing the food or opening the packets, you know, they find it quite relaxing. So you know, each to their own. But you know, so these videos are usually created for that community rather than sexual enjoyment. But despite this, I do still feel that they serve a role within the body positivity perspective, because they kind of help to normalise the lifestyle behaviours, particularly those associated with food, that the anti-obesity perspective kind of demonises and attaches really negative connotations to. So, you know, as we talked about earlier, the anti-obesity approach, it's kind of centered around this idea of personal responsibility. And it's, you know, as we talked about before, with like the MyFitnessPal and Map My Ride or Map My Run or Slimming World, it's very focused in on food-related behaviours, and this kind of idea of vigorous tracking of calories and exercise. So, you know, these video trends, you know, although they're often seen as quite a positive development within the body positivity movement, you know, it is also worth noting that they, you know, like any other theory, you do have to look at them through a critical eye. So a really good reference that you can refer back to here again is Matthews, so same spelling as before, Matthews 2019. So what Matthews says, or what he points out, is that whilst some degree of normalisation is positive, because, you know, everyone overindulges from time to time, these behaviours shouldn't be promoted as part of our regular eating routines, because they're often closely associated with the development of, you know, quite serious eating disorders. So, you know, you've got things like binge eating disorder, binge purge syndrome, and other mental and physical health issues. So if we take a step back, you know, that idea of everyone overindulges from time to time, you know, I'm sure that everyone watching this video is more than aware that they've overindulged from time to time. You know, I'm guilty of it. After a night out, box of 20 chicken nuggets and a cheeseburger, yeah, sorted. So, you know, everyone does it. You know, comfort eating, Christmas, lockdown with like boredom eating. There's a really, really good article. I cannot remember the scholars that published it, but if you pop it into Google Scholar, it should come up. And it's called Covobesity, a New Pandemic. It talks about the link between COVID-19 and boredom eating and obesity. And it kind of plays into the idea of the obesity epidemic that the anti-obesity perspective coins. So, you know, that could be a really good reference you could use for that. So, you know, that idea of everyone overindulging, I'd say that's a completely accurate observation made by Matthews. But, you know, we do obviously have to acknowledge the role of you know, the biomedical perspective, both in critiquing the body positivity movement and the anti-obesity perspective. You know, obviously we used it before, and obviously now we can relate it back to, you know, the binge eating disorder, binge purge syndrome, and that kind of thing. So if I just quickly divert your attention back to the screen, if you're going to be using mukbang videos as examples in your work, I do just want to clarify the distinction and why I've got two different types of video on the screen. So these are 10,000 calorie challenges and these are mukbang videos. So the key kind of difference is that mukbang videos, the creators that make them are often well known for the mukbang videos. You know, their viewers have subscribed to them on the basis that that is the content that they're going to be getting on a regular basis. So, you know, these are created on a regular schedule, and I'd say it's the mukbang videos in general that are targeted more by this biomedical critique about promoting unhealthy lifestyle behaviours. And in a way, you could argue that these videos may fuel the assumptions made by the anti-obesity approach, because essentially, you know, they're kind of playing into that idea of self-blame, self-regulation. You know, it's the person's fault for their own condition. They're responsible for their own condition. So, you know, that's definitely something to bear in mind. It is different to the 10,000 calorie challenges, because even just the language, 10,000 calorie challenge, you know, the word challenge implies that it is in fact a challenge. It's hard to do. It is not something that you would do in your regular routines, and these videos are often, quite frankly, a bit of a cash grab by larger YouTubers. You know, they're kind of one-off, they get the views in, they're often clickbaited, you know, so they're not to be taken as seriously as I'd say the mukbang trend. So if you're going to be using them, just obviously be aware of the distinction and the different kind of theoretical critiques that come with each kind of video. So that concludes everything that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So if I just skip across to my last slide, firstly I just wanted to thank you all for listening. I've never guest lectured before, so this is all fairly new to me. I'm more than aware that I've chucked so many different arguments and examples and criticisms at you today, and I'm aware that it's probably been quite a lot to take on. So if you do have any further questions about any of the material that I've covered in this lecture, please do contact me, and feel free to drop me an email at the email address below. And I will clear up any queries that you may have. I am going to forward the file for this PowerPoint onto Jo, so she'll have access to that. I'm hoping she'll release it as well so that you can have access to it. I'm quite aware that the video recording software I've used has distorted a few of the slides, which I was quite annoyed about, but obviously, you know, if there are any little bits of the slide that you're kind of struggling to read, you can obviously go back through the PowerPoint yourself, and you know, you can have a look at that in a little bit more detail. But yeah, so in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Good luck with your assignments and have a great rest of your week. Thanks very much. Bye.